In the year 1910, when a deadly epidemic swept across northern China, the world stood on the brink of disaster. The disease killed within 2 days and could wipe out millions. No one knew how to stop it, except one man. His name was Liande. Together with 13 doctors, he challenged death, and won. 7 of them died. The rest disappeared from the history books. This is the story of how science, courage, and self-sacrifice stopped the plague, and were forgotten. Almost. At the very end of 1909, an invisible threat hung over northeastern China, then still a semi-autonomous and troubled region known as Manchuria. Winds driven by snow-covered hills swept through the deserted streets of Harbin, blowing out candles in houses where panic was already setting in. The first deaths were strange. A young hunter returning from the north collapsed and died in a hotel. His face quickly turned black, and by morning, 2 guests from the neighboring room had also died. Medical examinations did not provide a clear diagnosis. The bodies were buried hastily, without autopsies. A few days later, the situation repeated itself. Again, black faces, fever, death within 2 days. Rumors began to spread faster than the disease itself. Some said it was a curse, punishment for the desecration of the graves of the Tungus shamans. Others whispered about secret poisons brought by Russian traders. But the truth was much more terrifying. It was the plague, but not the kind known since the Middle Ages. By January 1910, several hundred people had already died. The disease spread along railways and trade routes. Everyone who came into contact with the sick fell ill themselves. This was not the bubonic plague, which humanity had somehow learned to fight. It was a pneumonic form that spread through the air. And that meant one thing: disaster. People in the streets of Harbin wore masks made of gauze and paper soaked in vinegar. Families abandoned their sick relatives in their homes, afraid of becoming infected. The authorities tried to impose a quarantine, but they did so hesitantly. The city was on the verge of complete collapse. Outbreaks of similar symptoms had already been reported in Port Arthur and Vladivostok. It seemed that China, exhausted and fragmented, would not be able to withstand such a blow. Even more frightening was that no one knew how to stop the infection. European doctors in the region put forward outdated theories. One of them, a French doctor named Mesnier, insisted that the disease was transmitted by fleas from rodents. He refused to believe that it could be transmitted from person to person. This cost lives. Meanwhile, rumors of what was happening reached Beijing. The situation required urgent intervention. But who should be sent to the epicenter of the outbreak? Most experienced doctors refused to go. No one wanted to become the next victim. Then the choice fell on a young but already well-known specialist, Dr. Wuliande, a graduate of Cambridge University, a Chinese man who combined a European education with a deep understanding of Asian culture and medicine. He did not yet know that he would face the greatest challenge of his life, that he would have to challenge not only the plague, but also fear, superstition, and even his own colleagues, and that he would be joined by 13 brave doctors whose names would almost disappear from the memory of history. Almost. Wu Liang was born in 1879 in Malaysia to a family of Chinese immigrants. He grew up in a colony where British strictness, Chinese wisdom, and Malay flexibility of spirit coexisted. As the first Chinese person admitted to the prestigious University of Cambridge, He became a symbol of a possible future, science open to the world. Returning to China, Liande dreamed of reforming medicine, getting rid of superstitions, and bringing health to people through knowledge. But fate had other plans. In December 1909, he received an order from the Qing government to leave for Manchuria immediately. A disease that no one could explain had already claimed hundreds of lives. Liande understood that this was his chance, not for his career, but for humanity. He packed a suitcase, took his medical instruments, masks, and books. A few days later, he was standing on the platform at the station in Harbin, in the center of the raging epidemic. The first thing he did was to autopsy the body of a person who had died from the infection. It was a risky move. His colleagues believed that the disease was bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas. But the autopsy showed that the patient's lungs were destroyed. Everything pointed to pneumonic plague, which is much more dangerous. This meant that the disease was airborne, transmitted from person to person, and every breath could be deadly. Liande immediately reported to the authorities and began to introduce emergency measures: mandatory masks, quarantine, isolation of the sick, and burning of corpses. He personally walked the streets, talked to residents, and explained what was happening. His approach was met with resistance, especially from European doctors. One of them, Dr. Gerard Massini, categorically rejected the theory of airborne transmission. He considered Liande an inexperienced dreamer and insisted on treating the premises for rats. Dr. Massini soon died of the plague. After examining his body, Liande publicly stated that the disease did not kill those who were careless, but those who refused to understand. This phrase spread throughout the medical community in Manchuria. Realizing that he could not cope alone, Liande turned to Beijing for help. He did not ask for officials. He was looking for doctors who were willing to share the risk with him. He found 13 people. All of them were Chinese. All of them were volunteers. And all of them knew that they might not return. They arrived in Harbin in January. They wore dark coats, carried suitcases full of medicine, and had eyes full of determination. Among them were young graduates and elderly doctors. Some of them left their families. Some left lucrative practices. But all of them chose to serve. Thus began their joint battle, not just against the virus, but against darkness, ignorance, and fear. There were no medals in this war, only sleepless nights, the cries of the dying, and a growing threat. But it is in moments like these that true heroes are born, and forgotten feats. Winter in Manchuria was merciless. The frost burned faces, and gusts of wind carried away lives. The plague did not retreat. It grew like a hungry beast, devouring village after village, neighborhood after neighborhood. But now it was opposed by people armed not with weapons, but with knowledge. At the center of this resistance was Dr. Liande and his team of 13. Their first task was to set up an isolation centers, the precursors of modern infectious disease hospitals. All patients were immediately separated from their relatives. Signs were painted on the doors, warning that death lay beyond. But this was not enough. The plague was transmitted by airborne droplets, and every breath taken inside the building could be the last. Liande did something that no one else in Chinese history had ever done. He made protective masks mandatory. These were simple gauze bandages, sometimes several layers thick, soaked in vinegar. He personally showed people how to wear them correctly. Everyone wore masks on the streets, in hospitals, and in shops. It became a symbol of resistance, discipline, and survival. This was followed by sanitary cordons. Guards were posted around infected areas, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Trade came to a standstill. The railways were partially shut down, a desperate but necessary step. The China Eastern Railway Corridor became particularly dangerous, as it could be used by infected people to reach Vladivostok and then on to St. Petersburg and Europe. Liande insisted on closing the stations. This sparked protests from Russian and Japanese officials. But he did not back down. One of the most controversial measures was the cremation of bodies of those who died of the plague. Traditionally, the Chinese buried their dead with honors, and cremation was considered sacrilegious. However, Wuliande explained that bodies were the main carriers of infection. He held a public demonstration. At first, protests broke out in the city. But then, the disease disappeared from the areas where the bodies had been burned. Resistance gave way to respect. Every evening, he gathered his team. 13 doctors, tired, haggard, but unbroken. They shared their observations and looked for patterns. One of them, a young doctor named Liande, noticed that the disease spread particularly quickly in poorly ventilated homes. This gave rise to the idea of airing out rooms. As a preventive measure, it was a simple solution, but it saved hundreds of lives. Gradually, the city began to breathe differently. People believed. They no longer hid in fear, but followed the rules. Every person saved was a victory. Every death prevented was proof that science was stronger than fear. But every victory came at a price, sometimes with one's own life. Soon, one of the doctors on the team began coughing up blood. He didn't even have time to say goodbye. And that was only the beginning of the losses. The battle for life continued. When 13 doctors arrived in Harbin, no one knew their names. The newspapers only wrote, "A group of volunteers from Beijing," a team of medical specialists. They did not demand honors or seek glory. Each of them knew that the chances of returning alive were minimal. But they came, and they stayed. Dr. Wuliande met them at the train station. The frost was bitter, the air like a knife. The doctors got off the train with suitcases tied with string, wearing gray coats and with eyes that showed no fear. Among them were young medical school graduates, doctors of Eastern medicine, and several female doctors. One of them, Dr. Wang Zhonghua, had just lost his wife and son to typhus. He wasn't going to save the world. He was going to save someone. They were given rooms in hospitals, but they had to work everywhere, at stations, in homes, on the streets. They performed autopsies, examined patients, and consulted with local doctors. During the day, they were on the front lines. At night, they were busy with records and analyses. In one of his notes, Dr. Wu wrote, "None of them are backing down. Even when their eyes are bloodshot and their hands are shaking from exhaustion, they continue. Their dedication is beyond my comprehension." Dr. Zhao was the first to die. He was treating a patient in a poor village near Mudanjiang. The patient died 2 days later. Dr. Zhao died 4 days later. He was followed by Dr. Liang, then Dr. Ma. In just 3 weeks, 7 out of 13 had died. From the infection they were trying to stop. Liande ordered their bodies to be buried according to all the rules, but also to be burned to eliminate any risk. He personally stood by the pyres, and he cried. The remaining 6 did not retreat. Every day, in white coats, masks, and bandages, they went out to face the disease. They no longer wrote letters home. One of them kept a diary in which he wrote, "If we don't do this, no one will." These lines would only be found many years later in the archives of an old hospital. Against the backdrop of their sacrifice, the local population began to change. People began to trust the doctors. Even those who considered the plague a curse from the gods began to bring water and food and help with isolation. Children called the doctors people in white who are not afraid of death. Step by step, an invisible wall was built between life and death. A wall built of courage and pain. 13 people, 7 dead, 6 survivors. Their names are almost gone from the textbooks, but it was they, without fanfare or flags, who stopped the plague before the rest of the world even realized it was standing on the brink of disaster. In early February 1910, the epidemic reached a critical point. The plague spread rapidly along the railway lines leading north to Vladivostok and south to the densely populated areas of China. The threat became international. A little more, and the deadly infection could have crossed the border, claiming thousands of lives in Russia, Korea, and Japan. Dr. Wuliande understood that time was running out. Every train and every trade convoy could become a vector of infection. He appealed to the governors to immediately cut off communication between the regions. This was met with fierce resistance. The railways were controlled by foreign companies, Russian, Japanese, and French. For them, closing the railways meant losses, panic, and a diplomatic scandal. Liande was summoned to the administrative building in Harbin. Representatives of foreign missions were waiting for him there. They accused him of scaremongering and exaggerating the threat. One Russian engineer said, "Your masks and restrictions will not save you from the inevitable." Liande calmly replied, "You are right. Not us. But perhaps they will save your children." This moment became a turning point. Under the pressure of facts, the rising death toll, the sudden deaths of foreign doctors, the refusal of hospitals to accept infected patients, the international community was forced to acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. Stations were closed, trains were stopped for health checks, quarantine posts were set up along the tracks. The 6 remaining doctors continued their work, despite exhaustion and risk. Dr. Lin, one of them, injected himself with quinine, hoping to prevent infection. Dr. Juan slept on the hospital floor, not leaving his post for several days. Legends began to spread among the locals that the doctors had made a pact with the gods to ward off death. But it was not magic. It was discipline and science. Strict protocols were introduced in every hospital. Visits were prohibited. Everyone who came into contact with patients had to be disinfected. All bodies, without exception, were burned. There were cases when families tried to steal the bodies of their relatives to bury them according to their customs. Force had to be used. But each such case could have been the beginning of a new outbreak. By early March, dozens of new doctors, inspired by the example of the first 13, joined the effort. But it was they, the pioneers, who were called the silent guardians of the border between life and disaster. They not only saved lives, they rewrote the rules that would later form the basis of infectious disease control in Asia. The threat was receding, but victory was not yet assured. As in any real war, the most difficult battle is always the last one. Spring came unexpectedly early to Harbin. The snow melted in the streets, revealing deserted neighborhoods where quarantine posts and smoldering bonfires had stood just a month earlier. The number of new cases fell day by day. Where funeral processions had recently passed, shops and schools reopened. Dr. Liande was not happy. He knew that victory in such battles was not a cause for celebration, but rather the silence that followed when death receded. By the beginning of April 1910, over 60,000 deaths had been officially recorded. However, the number could have been higher, as bodies were buried without registration in remote villages. Yet despite the tragedy, the most terrible threat had been averted. The epidemic did not spread beyond Manchuria, did not cross into Russia, and did not reach the seaports. In medical and political circles, this was regarded as an incredible achievement. Liande received a letter from Beijing expressing the deepest gratitude of the Qing government. But he was more concerned not with gratitude than with the Fi International Medical Conference. He had proposed to hold right in the epicenter of the former epidemic, in Shenyang. In May, doctors from China, Japan, Russia, France, and England gathered in a conference hall that had once been converted into a reception center for the infected. Liande gave a presentation explaining why mass cremation, mandatory mask wearing, and isolation of patients played a key role in stopping the epidemic. His report caused a sensation. He proved that even without antibiotics, even in a poor country, science can defeat death if it is applied honestly, consistently, and with courage. After his speech, he was surrounded by reporters, doctors, and officials. They asked him how he managed to organize everything and how he managed to convince people. He replied, "I couldn't have done it alone. All this is the work of my comrades, and I lost half of them." His voice faltered. He did not name names, but he had a list in his pocket. 7 names. 7 lives given selflessly. Later, at a closed meeting, Japanese professor Tokutaro Takamin bowed to Wuliande. It was a rare gesture, especially towards a Chinese person. But even in a difficult political climate, the scientist acknowledged, "You saved not only China, you saved us too." By summer, the epidemic had been completely stopped. Harbin once again became a trading hub, and the streets were filled with life. But the memory of those days remained within the walls of hospitals, in notes in the margins of archival documents, in faded photographs, where figures in white coats look into the camera with fatigue and determination. They did the impossible, and they faded into the shadows. True victors rarely demand rewards. History does not always remember those who save, but more often, those who destroy. Victories over evil, especially silent ones, leave no ashes behind, and therefore often disappear from the memory of generations. This was the case with the feat of 13 Chinese doctors. After the epidemic ended in 1910, the name of Dr. Wuliande was still heard in international medical circles. He published reports, spoke at conferences, and reformed the Chinese healthcare system. But almost nothing was written about his comrades, those who died in Harbin, those who chose to sacrifice themselves to save others. Their names did not make it into textbooks. They did not appear on monuments. Why? Partly because of the political context. China in those years was in a state of agony. The Qing dynasty was collapsing, and revolution was near. A year later, the Xinhai Revolution would break out, and the country would enter a period of fragmentation and civil war. History seemed to shift its focus, rushing after military marches and regime changes. The exploits of the medics became an inconvenient backdrop. They reminded people that life is fragile and that it is not guns but masks that can save an empire. Moreover, national pride often does not tolerate memories of being saved by technical specialists rather than generals. The 13 doctors were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not carry weapons or go into battle. They simply did their job, and they died for it. In the popular memory, overflowing with military exploits and myths, there was no place for them. Even Dr. Liande himself faced alienation in his later years. In the 1930s, he left mainland China and worked in Malaysia. His work was forgotten, replaced by new scientists and new ideologies. It was only after World War II, when the world was once again faced with global epidemics, that interest in his experience returned. But it was too late. Most of the documents had been scattered in archives, and there were almost no witnesses left. And yet, the memory is returning. At the beginning of the 21st century, an epidemic museum was opened in Harbin. There are masks, letters, photographs, and a list of 13 names. Today, these people are the subject of scientific research, documentary films, but most importantly, recognition. Their feat is being revived in stories, books, and histories such as this one. We live in a world where epidemics are once again making themselves felt. And that is why it is important to know that once, in Manchuria, a group of unknown doctors held back death when no one else dared to do so. They did it not for glory or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And if history really teaches us anything, it is to remember those who saved lives, not just those who destroyed them. Memory is also a form of protection from oblivion and from repeating mistakes.